Velari Onthas had seen many strange things in her years as a scientist. She had touched the surface of a frozen moon with her bare hands. She had catalogued creatures that had no eyes, no sound, and no fear. She had once stood at the edge of a gas giant's upper atmosphere and watched lightning move in slow, golden rivers below her feet. But of all the strange things she had encountered in her life, nothing confused her quite as much as her husband. His name was James Calloway. He was human, and on most days, he seemed like the least threatening living thing on the entire ship. The CSS Unbroken Meridian was a deep space survey vessel, long and gray and built for function rather than beauty. It carried a crew of 41, mostly Thesari, like Velari, but also a few Dorani, one very quiet Mavrith engineer, and James. The ship had been sailing through the outer Kelvari expanse for nearly 9 months now, mapping star systems that had never been mapped, collecting data that no one had ever collected. It was important work. Slow work. The kind of work that gave a person a lot of time to think. Velari spent a lot of that time thinking about James. She watched him that morning from across the corridor, as he crouched beside a broken water recycler, his tools spread out on the floor around him in a neat half-circle. He was humming something, a low, tuneless sound that he made without seeming to notice he was making it. His hands moved carefully over the machine's inner parts. He had a small smear of grease on his cheek. His dark hair was slightly too long and fell across his forehead when he leaned in close to look at something. He looked up at her and smiled. "Morning," he said. "There's a cracked pressure valve in here. Should be fixed in about an hour. You were supposed to be off duty this morning," Velari said. He shrugged. "Dren mentioned the recycler was making a noise last night. I figured I'd take a look before breakfast." Velari said nothing. She watched him turn back to his work, still humming, completely unbothered. That was the thing about James. He was always doing something like this, fixing something that was not his responsibility, helping someone who had not asked for help, noticing small problems before they became large ones. He did it quietly, and without any expectation of thanks. By Thessari standards, this behavior was difficult to understand. Thessari were a tall, strong people. They had dense muscle across their shoulders and backs, hard ridged skin along their forearms, and eyes that could see clearly in near total darkness. They had evolved on a world with heavy gravity and sharp seasons, and their bodies showed it. Strength was not just a physical quality among the Thessari. It was something close to a moral one. A strong person protected what was theirs. A strong person did not need to ask for help. A strong person certainly did not crouch on a corridor floor fixing someone else's broken machine before breakfast. James was not strong. Not in any way the Thessari understood the word. He was shorter than every Thessari on the ship by at least a head. His skin was smooth and soft, with no natural protection at all. A single deep cut could do him serious damage. He could not see well in low light. His hearing was limited. His reflexes, though he seemed unaware of this, were noticeably slower than those of any Thessari crew member. He got cold easily. He got tired easily. He bruised easily. He also laughed very easily, which the Thessari crew found almost as puzzling as everything else about him. Velari remembered the first time she had told her colleagues she was going to marry him. There had been a silence that lasted just a little too long. Then Captain Dren, who was a careful and polite man, had said, "He seems very gentle." In Thessari, the word he used, Vethara, carried a meaning that sat somewhere between calm and unlikely to survive. It was not a compliment. It was not quite an insult either. It was simply an honest observation, delivered with the practiced neutrality of someone trying hard to be supportive. Velari had married James anyway. She loved him in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not met him. He was kind, without effort. He was curious about everything. He asked her questions about her work and actually listened to the answers. He remembered small things, her favorite food, the particular way she liked her sleeping temperature, the names of her childhood friends back on Thessar. He never made her feel strange for being who she was, even when who she was made very little sense to him. But there were moments, private moments, the kind she would never say out loud when she looked at him and felt something close to worry. She watched him now as he finished the water recycler and began packing his tools back into their case, each one placed in exactly the right spot. A young Thesari crew member named Torva walked past, and James held up a small metal component. "Hey," James said. "Tell Dren the pressure coupling on Recycler 7 was cracked." "I replaced it, but he should know." Torva looked at the component, then at James, then at Velari. There was a brief expression on Torva's face, the particular expression of someone looking at a very small animal doing something unexpectedly useful. And then Torva took the component and moved on. James stood up, stretched, and rolled his shoulders. "Breakfast?" he said to Velari. "Yes," she said. They walked together to the crew mess. James got himself a tray of food, and immediately gave the dessert portion to a Dorani crew member who had mentioned, 2 days ago, that she enjoyed that particular flavor. The Dorani looked surprised. James grinned and sat down and started talking about something he had read in the ship's database the night before. Something about the gravitational behavior of binary stars. Velari ate and listened and watched him. She watched the easy way he talked, the way he made the Dorani crew member laugh, the way he turned in his seat to answer a question from someone 3 tables away as if he had known them his whole life. She thought about what she had written in her private log the night before. "He is everything to me. I would not trade him for anything. But when I look at him beside these people, beside any of these people, I see how fragile he is. He does not seem to notice it himself. Perhaps that is the most human thing about him. He lives in this dangerous universe, as if it does not apply to him." She had paused for a long time after writing that. Then she had added one more line. "I love him. I only wish he were stronger." She closed her eyes briefly, sitting across from him in the bright mess hall, listening to him laugh at something the Dorani had said. He reached across the table and touched Velari's hand without looking at her, a small, absent gesture, the kind that meant nothing and everything at once. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the wide observation windows, the Kelvari expanse stretched on forever, dark and cold, and full of things that had never been named. Velari told herself that everything was fine. She told herself that every morning, the alarm came at night. Not the soft chime that signaled a course correction or a routine system check. This was the hard alarm, the one that lived in the walls and came out like a living thing, low and pulsing and impossible to sleep through. Red light flooded every corridor on the CSS unbroken meridian, turning the familiar gray hallways into something that felt like the inside of a wound. Velari was on her feet before she was fully awake. James was already sitting up beside her, his eyes open, his face completely still. He was listening. She had noticed that about him before when something startled a Thesari. They moved first and thought second. When something startled James, he went very quiet for just a moment, like an animal that had heard a sound in the dark and was deciding exactly what it meant. "That's the breach alarm," he said. His voice was calm. Not the calm of someone who was not afraid. The calm of someone who had heard this sound before, not on this ship, but somewhere deep in their memory, in the old part of the brain that kept records of things that could kill you. Velari was already pulling on her uniform. "Battle stations. Move." The corridor outside their quarters was chaos. Crew members ran in both directions, some still fastening their gear, some already carrying weapons. The red light made everyone look like strangers. Velari could hear Captain Dren's voice over the ship's comm system, steady, clipped, giving orders in the precise, flat tone of a man who had been in emergencies before and had decided a long time ago that panic was a waste of time. "All crew to battle stations. Unregistered vessel has locked onto our port side. Breach pods confirmed. This is not a drill." Velari stopped moving. Breach pods. There was only one kind of ship that used breach pods. "Vreth," said someone nearby, in a voice that was barely a whisper. The word moved through the corridor like a cold wind. She watched crew members who had been running suddenly move faster, not out of discipline, but out of fear. The Vreth were not pirates. Pirates wanted cargo, wanted credits, wanted things you could negotiate over. The Vreth wanted something that could not be negotiated. They came to harvest. Biological material, mostly crew members processed into components for a dozen different industrial uses that Velari had read about once and tried very hard to forget. They did not take prisoners. They did not leave survivors. They came, they took what they needed, and they left. Every species in known space was afraid of the Vreth. The only argument anyone had ever had about them was whether it was smarter to fight or to run. Running was rarely an option once the grapples were locked. The ship shuddered. The sound that followed was not an explosion, it was worse than an explosion. It was a tearing sound. The long metallic groan of hull being pulled apart at a breach point. Then another sound, lower and rhythmic, like something heavy walking in a place that was not built for walking. "They're inside," Valari said. She turned to find James. He was not behind her. She spun around, scanning the corridor, and found him 6 meters away, moving in the opposite direction from the battle stations toward the breach. He had his engineering toolkit over one shoulder and a portable comm unit clipped to his collar. He was not running. He was walking with the particular focused walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was not wasting a single step getting there. "James." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and grabbed his arm. "The battle station is the other way. You need to, I know." He looked at her. His face was different now, not frightened, not excited, not any of the things she would have expected. It was focused in a way she had not seen before. His eyes were steady and dark and completely present, the way they got when he was deep in a repair problem that no one else had been able to solve. "I'm not going to a battle station. James. Vel." He said her name the short way, the way he said it when he needed her to listen. "I know this ship. I know every system, every corridor, every weakness, every shortcut. I've been running failure drills on this ship's structure since week 2. He looked at her for one more second, a long second, a full second, the kind that holds more than most minutes do. "The Vreth don't know this ship. I do." She stared at him. Around them, crew members pushed past. The alarm kept pulsing. The red light kept bleeding down the walls. "The science team needs protection," he said. "Your lab sector, the lower deck crew, they need someone between them and the breach points. That's you." He adjusted the strap on his toolkit. "This is me." She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell him that he was soft-skinned and slow-reflexed, and that whatever he was planning to do alone in the maintenance corridors of a ship being boarded by Vreth harvesters was going to get him killed in a way that she would never recover from. She wanted to say all of that. Instead, she grabbed the front of his collar and pulled him close, and pressed her forehead against his the Thesari gesture for, "Come back, come back, come back," and held it for exactly 1 breath. He put his hand over hers, squeezed once. Then he was gone, moving down a side corridor, ducking through a maintenance hatch that she had walked past 100 times without ever thinking about what was on the other side. She stood there for 1 second longer than she should have. Then she turned and ran toward the science deck. The next several hours were the longest of her life. She organized the science team into the most defensible room on the lower deck. A sealed specimen storage lab with 2-inch walls and a lockable interior hatch. She armed the 3 crew members who had weapons training. She kept the others low and quiet. She listened to the sounds of the ship, and the sounds of the ship were strange. She had expected to hear fighting, the crack of weapons, the heavy footfalls of Vreth hunters moving through corridors, the sounds that a boarding action was supposed to make. She heard some of that. She heard Thesari warriors engaging at the main breach points, heard the comm traffic from Captain Dren become tight and urgent. She heard 2 explosions, distant and muffled. But she also heard other things. She heard doors sealing, not the normal doors, but the heavy internal bulkheads, the ones that were only supposed to close in a total hull failure. She heard pressure changes, small ones, localized, the kind that happened when atmosphere was being redirected through secondary systems. She heard the low hum of the ship's repair drone bay activating, which made no sense, because no one had authorized a drone deployment. She heard the ship changing. She pressed her ear to the cold wall of the specimen lab and listened to the unbroken meridian becoming something different, not damaged, not breaking, but rearranging itself, shifting its own layout in ways that served a purpose she could not quite understand. Then she understood. James was not running through the ship. He was playing it. She opened her comm unit. "James," she said quietly. "James, are you..." Static. Then, faint and slightly breathless. "Still here. Busy. Love you." The comm cut out. Velari sat with her back against the cold wall of the sealed lab, her weapon in her hands, and listened to her husband do something she had no words for yet. Outside, in the red-lit corridors of the unbroken Meridian, the Vreth were discovering that the ship they had boarded was not the ship they thought it was. Much of what James Calloway did that night was only understood afterward, when the ship's logs were pulled and the crew sat together in silence and watched what had happened in corridors where none of them had been standing. At the time, Velari only heard pieces of its sounds through walls, fragments on the comm, the ship moving around her in ways that felt purposeful and strange. But later, when she reviewed the full record, she understood the shape of what her husband had done. She understood it the way you understand a painting only when you step back far enough to see the whole thing. It began at Junction 4, North, 7 minutes after James disappeared into the maintenance hatch. The Vreth breach pod had torn open a section of the port corridor near the crew quarters. 3 Vreth hunters had come through the first breach, large, armored things, moving fast and quiet on 6 limbs, their pale, scanning eyes sweeping the corridor in slow arcs. They were experienced boarders. They had done this many times. They knew how crew members panicked, where they hid, how long it took a frightened being to make a decision. What they did not know was that the corridor they were walking down was no longer connected to the rest of the ship in the way it had been 60 seconds ago. James had sealed the forward bulkhead from a panel inside maintenance shaft 4C, which ran parallel to the main corridor like a shadow. He had sealed the rear bulkhead 2 seconds later. The 3 Vreth hunters were now standing in a section of corridor that was, in every meaningful sense, a box. They did not realize this immediately. They moved to the forward bulkhead and found it locked. They turned to the rear and found that one locked too. They had weapons that could cut through most materials, but cutting through a reinforced internal bulkhead took time, and James, watching through the maintenance shaft's diagnostic screen, was already moving to the next problem. The second Vreth party had come through a different breach, lower on the ship, near the engineering section. There were 4 of them, and they were moving with the kind of speed and coordination that came from doing the same thing many times. They split at the first junction, 2 going left, 2 going right, the way a hunting party moves when it knows the layout of a space. Except the layout had changed. James had rerouted corridor access through the ship's tertiary control nodes, closing 3 junctions that should have been open and opening one that was almost never used, a service passage so narrow that Vreth, with their wide armored bodies, would have to move through it single file. A Vreth moving single file could not flank, could not surround, could not do any of the things that made Vreth boarding parties so dangerous. He also vented a small amount of the atmosphere from that service passage, not enough to suffocate anyone quickly, but enough to drop the oxygen to a level where their movements would become slower and their coordination slightly dulled. Their suits could compensate, but compensating took a moment, and a moment was all a ship needed. 2 of the 4 were rerouted directly into a section where Thessari warriors were waiting. Captain Dren later said he had no idea why the Vreth appeared exactly where they did, at exactly that moment, in exactly that configuration. He said it felt like something had dropped them there. It had. The third problem was the worst one. A Vreth hunter, a larger one, a unit type that served as a party leader, had broken away from the main groups and was moving through the ship's secondary corridors with a kind of quiet intelligence that was different from the others. It was not rushing. It was reading the ship, touching walls, looking at junctions, learning the layout the way a careful predator learns new ground. It was going to figure out the patterns. Given enough time, it was going to find the maintenance shafts. James was 3 sections ahead of it, moving through crawl spaces that required him to pull himself forward on his elbows, which was not comfortable and which he later described, with what Velari considered an extraordinary amount of calm, as pretty tight in places. He reached the repair drone bay before the Vreth leader reached Section 7. The drone bay held 12 small maintenance drones machines designed to crawl through tight spaces and fix things with small, precise tools. They were not weapons. They were not fast. They were not impressive in any way that the word impressive usually applied to things. James spent 4 minutes reprogramming 6 of them. He sent them into the corridors ahead of the Vreth leader, not to attack, but to obstruct. The drones moved into the Vreth leader's path at junction after junction, not blocking it completely but slowing it, forcing it to stop and assess, costing it seconds that added up into minutes. Two of the drones, sent ahead to a specific panel near Section 7, pulled a secondary power relay loose in a way that caused a controlled electrical discharge across a 3-meter section of floor. The Vreth leader stepped on it. It did not kill the Vreth. It was not meant to. It was meant to damage the sensors in its lower limbs, the organs Vreth used to feel vibration, to detect heartbeats through flooring, to locate hidden crew members in sealed rooms. The discharge did exactly that. The Vreth leader stood in the corridor for a moment, very still, and then began moving more slowly, more carefully, in the manner of a hunter that could no longer fully trust what its body was telling it. And then James, in maintenance shaft 7B, directly above the Vreth leader's position, opened a fire suppression valve. The corridor filled with suppressant foam, thick, fast, and extremely cold. The Vreth leader was armored, but armor that could stop a weapon could not stop foam that expanded to fill every gap and joint and external sensor opening. The Vreth leader went down, not dead but completely immobilized, locked inside a rapidly hardening shell of white foam, unable to move anything. James pulled himself forward in the maintenance shaft, reached a junction hatch, dropped down into the corridor, and looked at what he had done for exactly 2 seconds. Then he picked up his toolkit and moved to the next problem. There were 2 more Vreth breach parties unaccounted for. He had already sealed their most likely routes. He had already calculated the atmospheric pressure changes that would force them left instead of right at junction 12. He had already identified the secondary plasma conduit that, with a carefully managed overload, would send a surge through the magnetic grapple cables and damage the breach pod guidance systems before the remaining pods could deploy. He was, by this point, bleeding from his left forearm, where he had caught it on a sharp edge inside a maintenance shaft. He had a burn across the back of his right hand from the plasma conduit work. One of his eyes was starting to swell from a collision with a low bulkhead in the dark. He was also, according to the audio record in his comm unit, still humming, the same tuneless, quiet sound he made when he was fixing a water recycler before breakfast. Valari, sitting in the sealed specimen lab with her back against the wall, heard none of this. She heard only the ship, the sounds of it shifting, changing, working. She heard the distant sounds of Thessari warriors engaging Vreth parties that arrived disoriented and reduced, and separated, cut off from their coordination, stripped of their advantages one by one. She heard the ship become something it had not been designed to be. She held her weapon and she listened. And somewhere in the cold maintenance shafts of the CSS Unbroken Meridian, her husband hummed softly to himself and took apart the worst thing in the known galaxy with a toolkit and 4 months of quiet, private planning. The Vreth ship disengaged at 0347 ship time. It pulled away slowly, not in the fast, decisive way it had arrived, but in the slow and uncertain way of something that had reached into a place expecting food and had found something it did not have a name for. The magnetic grapples released. The remaining breach pod tubes, their guidance systems burned out by the plasma conduit surge, detached uselessly and drifted. The long black shape of the harvester claw ship turned in the dark and moved away without making a sound. The alarm stopped. The red light faded. The CSS Unbroken Meridian sat in silence for a moment, the way a person sits after a very long run, not still, but recovering, the sound of its own system slowly returning to something like normal. There were sections of corridor that would need full repair. There were breach points that had to be sealed. There were 4 Vreth hunters in various states of incapacitation, locked in different parts of the ship, which was going to create a significant amount of paperwork. But the crew was alive. All 41 of them. Valari had come out of the specimen lab the moment Dren's voice came over the comm, telling the crew to stand down. She had walked quickly through corridors that smelled of suppressant foam and burned metal, and something else, something sharp and animal that she recognized. After a moment, as the smell of Vreth, she had stepped over debris and past Thessari warriors who were standing in small groups, weapons still in hand, talking in the low voices of people who were still processing what had just happened. She was looking for James. She found him at Junction 7. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, his toolkit beside him. He was looking at the ceiling. The corridor around him was a mess foam residue on every surface, scorch marks on the floor near the access panel he had used, a long crack in the wall where the electrical discharge had left its mark. The Vreth leader, still locked in its shell of hardened foam, was propped against the opposite wall like a strange piece of furniture. James looked terrible. There were burns on his hand and forearm. One eye was swollen nearly shut. He had a gash along his left arm that had been sealed with emergency foam, not the suppressant kind, the medical kind, which meant he had found a first aid kit somewhere, and used it on himself, without stopping whatever he was doing. His uniform was torn in two places, dark with grease, and something that might have been blood. His hair was even more disordered than usual. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and gave her the same smile he always gave her, the unhurried, easy, slightly crooked smile that she had fallen in love with over a shared meal at a research station 3 years ago. "Hey," he said. She sat down on the floor beside him, which was not a thing Thessari normally did, and put her arms around him carefully, because he was clearly very hurt, and she did not want to make anything worse. He leaned into her without hesitation, the way he always did. They sat like that for a while. Then the others started arriving. It began with Torva, the young crew member who had taken the water recycler component from James that morning, who had looked at him with that expression of polite confusion and moved on. Torva came around the corner, took in the scene in Junction 7, and stopped. The Thessari warrior looked at the foam-locked Vreth leader, looked at the scorch marks, looked at James sitting on the floor with his burns and his swollen eye and his emergency foam-sealed arm. Torva was quiet for a long moment. "You did this?" Torva said. "Most of it," James said. "The warriors finished off the ones I rerouted to them." "You rerouted them. The bulkhead controls in Shaft 4C connect to the tertiary junction grid. If you know the sequence, you can redirect corridor access from there." James shifted slightly. Winced. "I'd been thinking about it for a while." Torva looked at Velaari. Velaari said nothing. She watched. More crew members arrived, drawn by word spreading through the ship, the way word always does, after something extraordinary, faster than any comm signal, person to person in the low, urgent tones of people who can't quite believe what they're being told. They came in ones and twos and stood in the corridor of Junction 7 and looked at the evidence of what had happened. Captain Dren came last. He was a tall man even by Thessari standards, broad through the shoulders, with a face that showed its age in the way of someone who had spent a great deal of it in difficult places. He had fought in 3 wars. He had commanded ships through situations that had killed lesser captains. He stood at the entrance to Junction 7 and looked at all of it. The foam, the burns, the crack in the wall, the incapacitated Vreth leader, the human sitting on the floor, and he was quiet for so long that several crew members glanced at each other, wondering if something was wrong. Then Dren walked across the corridor and crouched down in front of James, putting himself at eye level, the way you do when you want a conversation to be between 2 people and no one else. "Tell me how you did it," he said. James explained. He was clear and precise and modest about it in the particular way of someone who has done something difficult and considers it simply the logical application of available information. He talked about the bulkhead sequences. He talked about the atmospheric rerouting. He talked about the drone reprogramming and the conduit surge and the pressure valve and the way Vreth hunting parties became significantly less dangerous when their coordination and flanking ability were removed. He talked about the failure simulations he had been running in his head since week 2 of the voyage, lying in the dark at night, mapping the ship's systems, asking himself the same quiet question over and over. If something went wrong, what would this ship be able to do? When he finished, Dren was still crouching in front of him, and the corridor was completely silent. Dren looked at James for a long time. Then he looked at the Vreth leader in its shell of foam. Then he looked back at James. "The Vreth study crew manifests before they board," Dren said slowly. "They identify threats. They plan around the most dangerous crew members." "Yes," James said. "They would have looked at you," Dren said. "A human engineer. No combat record. No augmentations. No physical threat classification." James smiled. "I know." Dren straightened up. He stood there in the ruined corridor and looked at the crew gathered around him. The sorry warriors, with their dense muscle and their hard skin and their lifetime of combat training. And then he looked back at the humans sitting on the floor who had just done what none of them had done. Valari watched Dren's face. She had known Dren for 6 years. She had rarely seen him surprised. She watched him be surprised now, and it was a complicated thing to look at, not embarrassment, not admiration exactly, but a genuine and total revision of something he had believed without ever knowing he believed it. Torva said, quietly, almost to no one. He was the most dangerous one on the ship. No one disagreed. Valari looked at her husband. He was looking at the ceiling again. That easy expression back on his face. Already somewhere else in his thoughts. Already thinking about the repairs. Probably. Already cataloging what needed to be done, and in what order. She had spent 9 months worried about how fragile he was. She had been measuring him in the wrong units entirely. She understood that now not as an idea, but as a physical feeling in her chest. The particular sensation of a belief you have held for a long time, cracking open, and becoming something larger and truer. She had been looking at a river and worrying that it did not look like a mountain. She had not understood that rivers and mountains are dangerous in different ways, and that a river, given enough time and knowledge and patience, can take apart a mountain completely. James looked over at her and raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was not sure that was true. But she was sure of something else, something she had not been sure of that morning, when she had sat in the bright mess hall holding his hand and telling herself everything was fine. She was sure, now, that everything actually was. The medbay on the CSS Unbroken Meridian was a small room with white walls and lights that were slightly too bright. It smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. There were 6 beds, 3 of which were occupied by Thessari warriors, with injuries from the boarding action cuts, burns, 1 broken bone in a forearm from a direct Vreth strike. They would all recover fully. James was on the 4th bed, sitting up rather than lying down, which the medic kept asking him not to do, and which he kept doing anyway. The medic, a capable Durrani named Sovi, was working on his arm with a tissue regenerator, moving the instrument slowly across the gash that ran from his wrist to his elbow. It was not a life-threatening wound, but it was deep enough that it needed proper treatment, and the emergency foam James had applied in the corridor had done its job of keeping the injury stable rather than actually healing it. Valari sat in a chair beside the bed and watched. James was talking to Sovi about the regenerator, asking questions about how it worked, listening to the answers with genuine interest, the way he listened to everything. Sovi, who had been nervous and shaken when James first came in, had visibly relaxed over the past 20 minutes. That was something else James did without trying. He made people around him feel that the situation, whatever it was manageable. Not because he pretended things were fine, but because his manner suggested that even the difficult things were simply problems, and problems had solutions if you looked at them carefully enough. Valari had been sitting in this chair for almost an hour. She had not said very much. James had not pushed her to, which was another thing she loved about him. He understood the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and a silence that needed to be respected. But there was something she needed to say. She had been carrying it since Junction 7, since she had sat on the corridor floor beside him and felt the shape of everything she had been thinking about him rearrange itself into something new and uncomfortable. "James," she said. He said, still watching what Sovi was doing. "I need to tell you something." He looked at her then. The medic glanced up briefly, then looked back down at the regenerator with the professional discretion of someone who has learned when to become very interested in their work. Valari looked at her husband, his swollen eye, his burned hand, the exhaustion that was starting to show now that the action was over, and his body was finally being allowed to report all the things it had been through. She looked at the face she had woken up beside every morning for 3 years, the face she had been worrying over, quietly, in the private part of herself, where she kept thoughts she was not proud of. She told him about the log entry. She told him simply, without excuses, the way you tell someone a truth that reflects poorly on you, when you respect them enough to let it. She told him about the word she had written stronger, and what she had meant by it, and how long she had been meaning it without ever saying it out loud. She told him about what Captain Dren had said when she announced the marriage. She told him about the way she had been looking at him, at his soft skin, and his slow reflexes, and his small, quiet body, and quietly, privately, without ever wanting to, measuring him against the sorry, and finding him insufficient. When she finished, the medbay was very quiet. James was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not hurt, not angry. Something more careful than either of those things. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know?" Not the specific words, but the feeling behind them. He shifted on the bed, adjusted his arm so Sophie could reach a different section. "Every species does it, Vel. It's not personal. You look at a human, and you see all the things that aren't there. The armor, the speed, the strength. Whatever your species has that we don't, and you fill the space with conclusions." He paused. "Humans do it too, with other species. Everyone has a version of that story. That does not make it right," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't, but it makes it understandable." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't act on it. You loved me anyway. You married me anyway. Whatever quiet worry you had, you chose me in spite of it. I am ashamed of it," she said. "I know." He reached over with his uninjured hand and put it over hers. "You're allowed to be. And I'm telling you it's okay. Both things can be true." She turned her hand over and held his, the same way she had in the mess hall that morning, though that morning felt like it belonged to a different voyage entirely, a different version of the ship, a different version of herself. "Tell me something," she said. "When you went into those maintenance shafts, were you afraid?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "But fear is just information. It tells you the situation is serious. It doesn't tell you what to do about it." He looked at their joined hands. "Humans have been afraid for a very long time. We come from a world that had things in it that wanted to eat us, from the very beginning. Big things, fast things, things with better eyes and better teeth and better everything. We didn't win because we were stronger. We couldn't be stronger. There was always something bigger." He tilted his head slightly. "We won because we learned the ground. We learned the weather, the seasons, the patterns. We made the environment do the work for us. It's the oldest human skill. It's in every one of us." Velari thought about the maintenance shafts, the bulkhead sequences, the atmospheric rerouting, the plasma conduit surge. A man in a crawl space with a toolkit and a complete mental map of a ship, turning that ship into something the Vreth had never encountered and had no category for. She thought about 10,000 years of frightened, adaptable, incurably curious creatures learning the ground. "The Vreth dismissed you," she said. "On the crew manifest." "I know," he smiled. "They saw a human engineer with no combat record and moved on to the next entry. That's the thing about being underestimated. It only hurts until it helps." She looked at him for a long time. There were things she wanted to say, large things, important things about what she had learned tonight, and what she intended to carry forward from it. But she found that the things she wanted to say were too big for the bright small medbay with its antiseptic smell and its slightly too loud lights. They were things that would need to be said over many mornings and many years, slowly, in the ordinary way, that important things are usually said between two people who intend to keep choosing each other. So she said only, "I am glad you are here." "Me too," he said. Sophie declared the arm done, applied a final regenerative patch, and asked James, one more time, to please lie down. James said he would in a minute. Sophie gave Velari a look that said clearly that a minute was not going to happen, and Velari gave Sophie a look back that said she was aware of this and had made her peace with it. Later that night, after James had finally under significant pressure agreed to sleep, Velari sat in the corridor outside the medbay and opened her personal log. She thought for a while before she wrote anything. Then she began. "He told me tonight that humans learned, a very long time ago, that survival is not about being the strongest thing in the room. It is about knowing the room." She paused. "I have been thinking about what that means. Not just in terms of what he did tonight, though what he did tonight was more than I have words for. I mean in a larger sense. The Vreth studied our crew manifest and dismissed the human. They looked for the biggest threats. They planned around the obvious dangers. They never considered that the most dangerous thing on the ship might be the one that had spent 4 months learning every weakness in its structure, every alternative route, every system that could be turned from its original purpose into something else entirely. They did not understand humans. I did not understand humans. I have shared a bed with one for 3 years, and I did not understand them. She stopped. Read back what she had written, then added, James is not weak. He is human. I understand now that these are not similar things. They are, in every meaningful sense, opposites. Weakness is the absence of capability. What James has this patient, quiet, unshakable attention to the world around him